It is just before dawn on December 19th, 1944, and fog is lying thick between the houses of Rocherath, a small farming village in the Belgian Ardennes. Corporal Truman Kimbrough's boots crunch on frozen mud as he presses himself against the corner of a stone barn, a bazooka tube resting against his shoulder. Behind him, a loader kneels in the shadow of a manure cart, a fresh rocket cradled in gloved hands. Neither man speaks. Somewhere beyond the mist, an engine growls, low and mechanical, growing louder with every second. The ground trembles faintly beneath their boots. Kimbrough can smell diesel exhaust drifting on the cold air, mixed with the wet stone and wood smoke of the village behind him. He has never fired at a tank this close before. The manual says 50 yards is dangerous. He's going to let it come to 30. A shape emerges from the grey, first as a smear of darker grey, then as a turret, then as the unmistakable, boxy silhouette of a king tiger, 68 tons of steel grinding towards the crossroads at the heart of the village. Kimbrough raises the tube. His hands do not shake. Somewhere down the street, 3 more bazooka teams are doing exactly the same thing, though none of them can see one another through the fog. What happens in the next minute and a half will decide whether the road to Elsenborn Ridge, and with it the northern shoulder of the entire German offensive, stays open or slams shut. The bazooka itself, officially the M1A1 rocket launcher, weighed just over 5 kilograms and fired a 2.36-inch shaped charge rocket capable of punching through around 100 to 120 millimeters of armor under ideal conditions. Against a king tiger's frontal glacis plate, it was almost useless. Against the thinner steel of an engine deck, a turret ring, or a rear plate at close range, it could be lethal, provided the men holding it had the nerve to let 60 tons of tank close to within a few dozen meters before pulling the trigger. That single tactical fact, more than any other, shaped what happened in Rocherath and Krinkelt on the morning of December 19th. By December 1944, the war in the West had settled, in American minds at least, into a grinding but manageable advance. The Wehrmacht had been pushed out of France, Field Marshal Montgomery's forces held the north, and General Eisenhower's armies stretched along an 80-mile front through the Ardennes forest, a region so quiet that American commanders used it as a rest area for battered divisions and a training ground for green ones. The 99th Infantry Division, barely 3 months in theatre, held a stretch of that line near the twin villages of Rocherath and Krinkelt, close to the German frontier. Adolf Hitler had other plans for this supposedly sleepy sector. On December 16th, under cover of pre-dawn darkness and appalling weather that grounded Allied air power, 3 German armies, numbering some 200,000 men and over 600 tanks and assault guns, surged forward in Operation Wacht am Rhein, aiming to punch through the Ardennes, seize the Belgian port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies in two. It was the largest single battle American forces would fight in the entire war. The northern hinge of that assault fell to the 6th Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, and its spearhead included the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a formation built around fanatically trained teenage soldiers and roughly 90 tanks, among them the fearsome King Tiger, whose 150 millimeters of frontal armor made it nearly invulnerable to the American bazooka's standard 2.36-inch rocket at any range beyond point blank. For 3 days, the 99th Division and the veteran 2nd Infantry Division rushed south to reinforce them, fought a desperate delaying action in the forests east of Rocherath-Krinkelt, buying time for artillery and reserves to mass on the high ground at Elsenborn Ridge behind them. By the night of the 18th of December, with German armour pressing from 3 directions and radio reports garbled by static and panic, the order came down: withdraw into the twin villages, hold the crossroads, and let the tanks come to you. The action inside Rocherath-Krinkelt on the morning of December the 19th became, in the words of the army's own official history, one of the most furious close-quarters tank fights American infantry experienced in the entire war. The villages themselves were narrow, half-timbered farming communities, their main streets barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, lined with stone barns, dung heaps, and low garden walls that offered natural cover but also boxed in retreat. Colonel Francis Booz of the 2nd Infantry Division's 9th Infantry Regiment had ordered every available bazooka team forward into the buildings and hedgerows along the approach roads, understanding that towed anti-tank guns and even Sherman tanks stood little chance against king tigers and panthers in open country, but that inside a village where a bazooka team could let a tank close to within 20 or 30 yards before firing into its thinner side or rear armour, the advantage flipped.
Officers moving through the villages that night reminded every team of the same instruction. Do not fire early. Do not fire from the front. Let the tank pass the corner before it knows you're there. Some teams were paired with a rifleman or 2 to cover the loader while he slid the next rocket into the tube, a process that took several seconds a man could not survive if the tank's own machine gun found him first. At roughly 700, a column of German armor, tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division supported by half-tracks of Panzer Grenadiers, began rolling down the main road from Würzfeld towards the crossroads at Rocherath. Visibility reduced to perhaps 40 yards by ground fog. Private Truman Kimbrough's team dug into the corner near the church, let the lead tank pass within 30 yards before firing a rocket into its rear deck, igniting the engine compartment. Seconds later, further along the same street, a second team knocked out the tank following behind it, trapping the column between burning wrecks with nowhere to maneuver in the confined lane. A 3rd and 4th tank, unable to reverse or turn in the narrow street, were struck within the same span of 90 seconds by teams positioned in a barn loft and behind a low garden wall, the rockets punching through engine grills and side plating that no frontal shot could have penetrated. Bazooka teams working in Krinkelt destroyed further vehicles using the identical tactic throughout the morning. Hold fire, let the tank commit to the street, strike from an angle the tube could actually defeat. The men who carried out these ambushes were, for the most part, ordinary infantrymen with a few weeks of bazooka familiarization behind them, not specialist tank hunters. Private First Class Richard Cowan of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, fighting nearby with the 2nd Division, would earn the Medal of Honor for holding a roadblock against advancing armor with a machine gun and bazooka after his squad was overrun, destroying a tank at close range before being killed, covering his platoon's withdrawal. Elsewhere in the village, riflemen who had never expected to fight tanks found themselves doing exactly that, using satchel charges and grenades bundled together when bazooka rounds ran short, climbing onto stalled vehicles to drop charges through open hatches. American artillery observers, some working from upper story windows with a clear line down the main street, called and fired so close to their own positions that shell fragments rattled off the walls beside them, breaking up the German infantry who would otherwise have cleared the bazooka teams out of the buildings ahead of the tanks. Civilians in Rocherath and Krinkelt, Belgian farming families who had lived under German occupation for 4 years, sheltered in cellars throughout the fighting. some later reporting that they could hear the tank's engines through the stone floors above them and could tell, by the change in pitch and the shouting that followed, roughly when another vehicle had been hit. For the German panzer grenadiers riding on the backs of the tanks, the fighting inside the villages was a different experience entirely from the open, fast-moving advance they had trained for. Many were teenagers of 17 or 18, drawn from the Hitler Youth movement that gave the 12th SS Panzer Division its name, and they found themselves cut off from the vehicles they had been escorting the moment a lead tank stopped burning in the street ahead, forced into house-to-house fighting against defenders who knew every wall and alley in the two villages far better than they did. American squads used the same stone barns that sheltered the bazooka teams to fall back through connecting yards and gardens when a position became untenable, a network of cover the attacking Germans had to learn under fire house by house, at considerable cost. If this deep dive into history has been interesting to you, consider subscribing. It helps far more than you might think. The cost of holding the crossroads was severe on both sides. American losses in the two-day fight for Rocherath-Krinkelt ran into the hundreds, with the 2nd and 99th Divisions suffering roughly 4,000 casualties combined during the wider defensive battle east of Elsenborn Ridge between 16th and 19th December, among the heaviest losses any American division absorbed during the entire Ardennes campaign. Yet the destruction inflicted on the German armored spearhead was disproportionate to the size of the force that inflicted it. Accounts from the fighting credit bazooka teams and accompanying tank destroyers, with knocking out somewhere between 17 and 25 German tanks, and assault guns in and around the twin villages during the 2 days of close fighting. A toll that included several of the near invulnerable King Tigers, whose armor had shrugged off American anti-tank fire everywhere else on the front. Wrecked and burning vehicles choked the narrow streets, blocking the road for the tanks still queued up behind them in open country, unable to bypass through fields turned to mud by December rain, and unable to force their way past the wreckage without exposing their own flanks to whatever remained of the ambush. German commanders, expecting the twin villages to fall within hours, found their timetable collapsing instead. The 12th SS Panzer Division, meant to punch through towards Elsenborn and then onward to the River Meuse, spent an entire day and night fighting for 2 farming villages that appeared on no strategic map as anything more significant than a road junction. Wehrmacht wore diaries from the period, recovered and translated after the war, register a rising frustration among staff officers as reports came back not of a breakthrough, but of a bottleneck, wrecked panzers, choking the only usable road, while flanking routes disappeared into fields too soft for armor after weeks of rain and early snow. That delay proved decisive. Every hour the German spearhead spent bogged down in Rocherath-Krinkelt was an hour American artillery had to dig in on the high ground of Elsenborn Ridge behind the villages, an hour reserves had to move up. And an hour the weather forecast edged closer to the clear skies that would eventually let Allied fighter bombers back into the fight. On the night of December 19th, the surviving American units in the twin villages were ordered to withdraw to Elsenborn Ridge itself, having accomplished what they had been sent forward to do. What followed was not a rout, but a deliberate fighting retreat, units leapfrogging backwards under covering fire, while engineers laid mines behind them in the road. By December 20th, the German advance in this sector, which had aimed to seize Elsenborn Ridge and the road network beyond it within the first 2 days of the offensive, had been stopped cold. The northern shoulder of the Bulge held for the remainder of the battle. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, denied the roads through Rocherath-Krinkelt and Elsenborn, was forced to shift its main efforts southward, funneling its armor into the sector around St. Vith and Bastogne instead, sectors that would themselves become famous for a different kind of desperate American defense. Historians examining the wider Ardennes campaign afterwards pointed to the fighting at Rocherath-Krinkelt as one of the moments where the entire German plan began to unravel. Wacht am Rhein depended on speed. Armored columns were meant to reach the Meuse within days, before American reserves could concentrate, and before the weather cleared enough for Allied air power to return. Every village, crossroads, and bridge that held longer than the German timetable allowed put the whole operation further behind schedule. The bazooka ambushes in the twin villages did not, on their own, defeat the German offensive, but they bought roughly 48 hours that the German 6th Panzer Army never recovered, hours during which the Americans transformed Elsenborn Ridge into a fortified line of massed artillery that would go on to fire more shells in support of the Ardennes defense than any other American position in the battle. The ridge held for the remainder of the campaign, and the 12th SS Panzer Division never reached the ground it had been ordered to seize on the offensive's opening day. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B and answerable directly to Hitler for the offensive's progress, is recorded as having pressed Dietrich repeatedly through December 19th and 20th for an explanation of why 2 undefended villages had absorbed an entire Panzer division's worth of momentum. There was no satisfying answer to give him beyond the plain fact that a few dozen infantrymen with bazookas, fighting from cover they knew intimately, had turned a narrow street into a trap that heavy armor could not escape. By late January 1945, the German salient into the Ardennes had been pushed back to roughly its starting line, at a combined cost to both sides of well over 100,000 casualties. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, badly bloodied at Rocherath-Krinkelt, were rebuilt with replacements and returned to the line for the advance into Germany itself. Corporal Truman Kimbrough did not live to see that advance. He was killed by machine gun fire on January 8, 1945, while clearing mines under fire near Rocherath, and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, one of several earned in that short, brutal fight for the twin villages. The stone barn where he first sighted along his bazooka tube still stands in Rocherath today, rebuilt after the war, its walls no longer scarred, but its foundations exactly where they were on that foggy December morning. Stand at that crossroads now, on a quiet afternoon with traffic passing gently through,